Hi, my name's Tal Hurwitz. I'm a librarian and archival project manager. Welcome to the 7th video in the Society of American Archivists instructional video series on Describing Archives, a Content Standard. In this video, we'll be going over Part 1 of DACS, the descriptive elements. Once this video is over, you should understand how to apply these elements to your own archival practice. You should also understand the difference between required, optimum, and added value elements. This video is free and available to anyone who wants to learn more about DACS. If you sign up to take the DACS workshop for credit, you'll be responsible for understanding this content. There will be a quiz to test your understanding. We'll be going pretty fast, but don't worry, you can always go back to any point in this video later. So, DACS is a content standard developed by the Society of American Archivists. It's particularly useful for its flexibility, scalability, and interoperability. It can describe lots of different media, both very big and very small collections, and it's specially designed to be output neutral. That means that it can operate in collaboration with existing structure standards, like MARC or EAD. The ways in which we describe archival material are broken down into a series of descriptive fields, or elements, within DACS. Some elements are required. This is the minimum amount of information you have to fill out to create a DACS-compliant description. Required elements are really the basic pieces of information necessary to accurately describe and access a record. Other elements can be added if you want to produce what's considered an optimum description according to DACS guidelines. These are recommended when appropriate and are used to further enhance records. They can be of great use in describing complex materials, items of particular interest, or larger collections. The remaining elements are described as added value elements. They may be of greater or lesser use, or sometimes they may not apply at all, depending on the particular work you're doing. Sometimes they're highly valuable and provide the researcher with information very important to a particular project, and sometimes they're just not necessary. The intended use of the records and nature of the materials being described generally dictate which added value elements you'll choose to include. We'll be going over the 9 required DACS elements in this video. You can always follow along at home with DACS, which can be found online at the website shown here. Before we start, you should know that DACS refers to each element by a chapter and a section code. For example, the reference code is identified as element 2.1. The 2 refers to DACS Chapter 2 identity elements. The .1 refers to this being the first element presented in the chapter. The first 8 chapters of DACS outline the hows and whys of describing archival materials. The 9 DACS required elements are found in chapters 2 through 8. For more information on Chapter 1, Levels of Description, please refer to video 5 in this series. There are several categories of DACS elements, identified by numbered headings. Required and optimum elements are found in most categories. Let's begin with a description of the identity elements. This is the reference code. This is the single most important way to track your items. A reference code is a unique, typically alphanumeric sequence. You can assign it based on whatever system your institution uses to organize their materials. This is a local reference code. Common local reference codes include things like accession numbers, call numbers, and unique identifiers for components. Remember that identifiers are repeatable. That means that any item or group of items might have more than one reference code, which could be how it's referred to in another repository system. Now, in addition to the local reference code, a DACS-compliant reference code will also include a standardized 3-letter code for your repository and a standardized code for the country. So, It's possible that another institution might catalog one of their items using the same local reference code as you've used for one of yours, but this extended reference code, including the repository and the country, is much harder to confuse or duplicate. They're necessary for processing material in an institutional consortium, and they help keep track of items when you send or receive exchanges, loans, or transfers. We have national and international standards for codes referring to institutions and countries, which help us remain consistent in assigning unique reference codes. One more thing about reference codes. They can be totally arbitrary, or clearly meaningful, or somewhere in between. This depends on how and why they're assigned. For example, computers sometimes assign complicated strings, but the rationale often isn't obvious or even really understandable to people. This sort of thing is more useful for machine processing. If the goal is human access, an archivist might assign a meaningful code, like institutional initials or other readable information. This is the repository responsible for the current storage of archival materials. You enter the whole name of the repository here and include any parent bodies. Also include the location, and if you want, you can add the whole address. A title isn't a summary of the item. The function of a title is just to name the item or group of items as concisely as possible. If you have a pre-existing title that's clear enough, you should use that. The title of a novel is a good example. That's what's considered a formal title and is transcribed according to the appropriate standard. Otherwise, as the archivist, you can create a devised title. This is a brief statement, usually composed of a creator name and a material type. In devising a title, it helps to take information from any available reliable source, including details you find in the materials themselves, a record schedule, communications with donors, or titles on other copies of the materials. Here's an example. I have a material manuscript written by Jane Author for an essay she wrote for The New Yorker titled Why I Left New York. It says that it's an early draft on the front page. A good title for this might be Jane Author, Why I Left New York, Draft. Or let's say I found this draft along with other drafts of other essays. It would be entirely sufficient to title this unit Jane Author Essay Drafts. If you'd like help with this, you can find very specific guidelines for writing devised titles in DACS. The archivist is expected to decide when it's appropriate to devise a title rather than to transcribe a formal title, especially one that could be potentially misleading. Most archival description actually involves devised titles, so this is an area where you're really encouraged to exercise your professional judgment. This field refers to everything a date could be used for to describe your material. That includes the date of item creation, the date it was accessioned, the date of publication, and more. DACS doesn't specify which type of date you should use, but you should be clear and consistent. You might end up using different types or formats of dates in working with DACS and your own structure standard, like Dublin Core or EAD. Use whatever's appropriate or what your institution standards require. You should be clear about which type of date you're referring to. For this element, clarity is key. The extent field describes the quantity and material types of the items being described. Including the quantity is mandatory and is described as a unit of measurement, like cubic feet, number of boxes, or number of items. You can also append material types to the quantity, like 1,000 photographs or 20 audio cassettes. Media can also be described in different terms. 20 CDs of digitized newsreels take up very little space, but potentially hold more condensed information than several linear feet of subject files. Being specific with the extent field is very important and has real consequences for our researchers. A user might not want to buy a plane ticket to visit the library if there's only 0.1 linear feet of material on their topic of interest. On the other hand, if there were 10 linear feet, they just might decide to visit. Either way, it's helpful to include specifics. The more information you include, the more guidance you give to potential researchers. This is where you establish the primary entities associated with the creation, assembly, accumulation, maintenance, or use of the materials. If you've created a devised title, the source for the name of the creator is usually found there. For archival materials, the creator is typically the corporate body, person, or family responsible for a body of materials. There are some exceptions. A creator can also be responsible for the intellectual content of an item, like the writer of a letter or the painter of a portrait. A collector or compiler of materials is considered the creator of the collection. Refer to DACS for further information on constructing this element. The scope and content field is usually the longest piece of writing involved in a DACS record. This provides information about the materials and activities related to the materials, including, but not limited to, how or why they were created, the characteristics of the records, the places that the items refer to, the subject matter, or any other pertinent information. This field can be pretty extensive, but it's very important and allows a user to further determine the material's uses and potential relevance to their needs. When you're doing a multi-level description, it's even more strongly recommended that you include a full description of the scope and content of the materials you're working with. In fact, having an extended description is a criterion for what's considered an optimum DACS multi-level system. This is where you can present any stipulations by which users are allowed to access these materials. The donor, repository, or even legal statutes might mandate some kind of regulated or conditional access. For example, a donor agreement might include a clause in which public access is restricted until a certain date, or you might have student records with restrictions of 75 years from the date of creation. Often, there are no limitations at all, which should also be indicated here. In all of these cases, the access policy should be described as briefly and clearly as possible. This is the statement governing whether a researcher can or can't use any part of the material, for what reason, and for how long. As appropriate, you can add details about the restriction. This denotes the languages of which a collection is composed. There are ISO standards for language and script codes that help with machine processing, but you can also write it out longhand. If there are mixed language collections or items, or entries in multiple scripts, you can indicate that here. If the collection has no linguistic content at all, you can also record that. So we've covered the descriptive elements that DACS uses for good, compliant archival description. I hope you found this video useful, and remember, you can always refer back to this resource. Thanks for listening, and be sure to check out the rest of the videos in the Society of American Archivists series on DACS to become an archival description pro.